han acompañado desde las sesiones anteriores. Buenos días, ahí espero que se terminen de conectar. Bueno, entonces empezamos. Buenos días a todos nuestros colegas participantes del gobierno, de las Naciones Unidas y de las instituciones académicas que nos acompañan el día de hoy. Es un placer estar conectada con ustedes hoy en esta segunda ronda de consulta del proyecto Mapeo de la Naturaleza para las Personas y el Planeta de Chile. Más adelante daré algunas especificaciones técnicas, entre ellas, por favor, mantener los micros silenciados. Si pudiera alguien ayudarme, hay un micro abierto. Mi nombre es Cassandra Llosa y trabajo en el PNUD como analista de involucramiento de actores claves en el Programa Mundial de Conservación para la Naturaleza, para el Desarrollo, perdón. Y bueno, seré su
Cassandra,
facilitador.
perdón,
¿Perdona?
estamos en el canal en español y estoy escuchando en inglés, ¿puede ser?
I'm sorry, was,
Ahora sí, ¿me escuchan bien?
yeah, okay, yeah, okay, I think I have, okay,
Listo.
okay.
Entonces, bueno, agradeceré que todas y
So
todos
I'd like to,
coloquen al costado de su nombre,
I'd like you
la
all
institución
to
de la que provienen, coloquen su nombre,
rename yourselves with your
algunos están
institution.
conectados, por ejemplo, entonces
For
dejen su
example,
nombre
if you have your names collected, connected to the name you use on your cell phones, change that to your institution, institutional name and position. So I'm going to, I have with me today Esteban Delgado from the Chile team. So Esteban, if you could introduce yourself. Good morning to all of you. Welcome to the second workshop for ELSA Chile. It's a great pleasure to be here today. And I wish you a great work session. Thank you, Esteban. So as I said, it's wonderful to connect with you today. And we met last year in November and January. Of course, we also had a session where we recapped all of our progress. What is important to mention is that we have held online meetings to be able to collaborate and reduce the coronavirus expansion or spread, sorry. So we hope that you will all remain healthy at home. So let's just address some logistics. Interpretation is available in Spanish and English. I activated mine. So you do this by going to your screen below. There's a globe, and you can select the language of your choice. So with us today, we have Veronica Perez and Thais Pardo. Thank you for being here. You're welcome. So we suggest that you select one channel and stay on that channel throughout the session to avoid technical mishaps. Andres, my colleague, has shared a screenshot where he explains how to activate the interpretation. So let me know if you connected correctly to the interpretation channel. Maybe you can give me a thumbs up or a green check. Okay, thank you so much. And just wanted to make some suggestions. Presenters, and if you do ask questions, speakers, make sure to speak a little bit slower so you can help the interpretation. And remember, this helps the flow of conversation. If there are any technical issues with Zoom, if you disconnect, for example, you can send a private message to our assistant, Andres Rosas, and this is his email. Take note, please. In case you have any problems, do not text your technical issues in the chat box. So we prefer, or you can send a private Zoom message in the chat box. Remember to keep your microphones on mute during the session to help the speakers with their presentations. If you have any questions during this session, and we will have Q&A sessions, there are two options: to raise your hand virtually or to jot that down, to write it in the chat, and we will proceed to request for the floor for you. We'll request the floor for you, or we'll ask a question ourselves. There's a website where you can find all of our recordings, our presentations. It's a document repository for our Learning for Nature program. There's also SCP training, Systematic Conservation Planning, and it's the UNDP and PACMARA, the Pacific Marine Analysis and Research Association training session. Andres will give you that link for Learning for Nature. It's adapted to Chile. And my colleague, Veronica Recondo, will help show you this, we'll show you how this website works, and we'll speak a little bit more about the training session. Vero. Good morning. Right now, I'm showing you the website that Cassandra just mentioned. It's specific for Chile and the second round of consultations. Here, you can find information, summary objectives, the agenda, logistics, and content of our consultation sessions for each session. And we'll be uploading information there, as well as systematic conservation planning data. As Cassandra mentioned, we have 5 modules with recordings, and each module includes a text or a questionnaire. After you finish them, you will be able to obtain a certificate if you so wish. So it's an introductory session or a training session to systematic conservation planning and its tools, and how this is applicable to the ELSA project. So I leave this information here for your reference. Thank you, Veronica. So you will all be given the link so you can access the PACMARA training website. We're preparing certificates of participation for all of the attendees at the second round of stakeholder consultations. So let's begin our round today. So as we learned during our first round of consultations held in November last year, we have it's an innovative program to be able to provide essential life support areas, to be able to map essential life support areas in Chile, ELSA areas. And the idea is to be able to meet your national commitments having to do with climate change and sustainable development. During our first round, you, the national experts who are here today, you select 12 priority commitments that the ELSA analysis will focus on. You also identified relevant data and data providers. So now the second consultation round is the one where we're going to get at the heart of the project, and we're going to work with the national team. So during this week and the next, we will co-create Chile's ELSA map. And the idea is to, begin this session officially today. So we're going to begin by giving the floor to Paloma Tranzos. She's head of the Environmental and Sustainable Development Program at UNDP Chile. And you have the floor, Paloma. Thank you, Cassandra. I'd like to greet you all welcome you to this session. I'd like to especially welcome Daniela Mavucevic, Head of Natural Resources and our head of Natural Resources and Biodiversity Division at the Ministry of the Environment in Chile. It's a great honor to have you. So today, well, we've almost 6 months have elapsed since we began this project, and we're very happy to see the progress that we've had, and we're very happy with that, and we're very hopeful for regarding the results we will get. We've undergone many political changes here in Chile. So what's important is to be able to address nature and its well-being and how it impacts individuals, and be able to appease society with the fact that we are addressing this in a concrete manner, this concern. As we've mentioned before, it's clear at the UNDP that human development is all supported indirectly or directly. It's based on contributions of nature's contributions to people. And we cannot attain sustainable levels through time without being concerned about the planet, ecosystem cycles, and the conditions and the services that they provide. But our country faces enormous challenges with regards to social, environmental issues, impacts having to do with the global climate crisis, and consequences having to do with regional and local issues such as drought, the water crisis the last decade, depletion of natural resources, and loss of biodiversity. Desertification and degradation of our soils, as well as reduction of the quality of the air and the environment of our cities, and severe environmental contamination in certain parts of the country. So dealing or addressing these objectives require holistic approaches, decisions made by social leaders, experts, particularly relevant stakeholders such as women, to be able to address processes that will act in an interconnected fashion and will address these problems based on participatory and innovative diverse focuses. So within this context, execution of the ELSA project is an invaluable opportunity to be able to understand and study these problems and implement integrated solutions. And evidence of this is being able to identify national priority commitments having to do, mentioned by Cassandra, and selection and weighting and planning for systematic conservation planning, which is part of the development part of this workshop of the ELSA project, so we can establish a national scale map. It is very hard to sustainably protect, manage, and restore our resources if we don't develop the capacity to observe and use technology available in a strategic fashion and integrated one as well. So the possibility of having tools and the possibilities of quality tools, such as those provided by the ELSA project, are of very high value. If we want to attain our development goals through socio-ecological and fair approaches, we need to think about not only what we have to do, but where and who we have to do this. So it is clear, it is key for the country to have an essential map for essential life support areas that is multi-sectorial and comprehensive in nature. So I'd like to thank everyone for their participation in this project, and we are always willing to collaborate in any issues that will have to do with attaining sustainable development. Thank you. Thank you, Paloma. Thank you for your support throughout the project. And we do thank you for your words of welcome and your support for the project. And we are very happy to work closely with the UNDP Chile team. I'd also like to now give the floor to Daniela Manusevic. I hope that we pronounced your name correctly. and she is the head of the Division of Natural Resources and Biodiversity at the Ministry of the Environment in Chile. And she will also share some words of welcome.
Muchas gracias, Cassandra. ¿Me escuchan bien?
Sí,
Thank you. Can you hear me? Yes, we can. I'd like to welcome the ELSA team, Paloma Toranzos, for representing the UNDP in Chile, and everyone, the rest of the agencies helping us with this project and different initiatives having to do with conservation of biodiversity. So I'd like to also welcome individuals from academia, different organizations, and biodiversity conservation organizations as well. This event is one of the first initiatives that I conduct within my role at the Ministry of the Environment. So I'd like to send the greetings of the Ministry of the Environment, Maisa Rojas, who for logistic issues was not able to be present. She has issues with her agenda. So the minister, she is following this initiative carefully, and as you mentioned and said, well, the current government is one that will begin uh, uh, to uh, to be able to address and define in a fair manner ecological issues, and we will address challenges such as water crisis, loss of biodiversity, and more specifically, issues dealing with gender and the environment, women in the environment. So this helps us emphasize the need for this ecological, very fair transition that will lead into a new development model based on the context that we are living in today, or experiencing today. So in order to be able to address and leave this spiral of economic despair and address all of the different mishaps that will make us more resilient, and where territories and communities will be able to effectively address and protect, restore, and sustainably manage its ecosystems. So society will never be able to support itself without addressing the pillars dealing with nature and the limits of nature. And this is a message I have reiterated many times. This transition that we're speaking about has to do with a great effort done by the government, by public policy, and starting at different levels to be able to work together with the state and society as a whole in a scaled fashion. These actions are relevant because they trigger this type of actions and mark the route that we must embark on. The ELSA project that we are developing at the ministry is a part of a fruitful collaboration with the UNDP, and in one that you are actively participating in. It's a highly relevant action, and this initiative aims to map the essential life support areas for the planet to be able to protect, manage, and restore the public policy objectives of Chile, defined by Chile. So in this sense, ELSA is a project that's very valuable because it'll provide a spatial representation of our environmental and socio-ecological policy objectives at a national scale, and be able to give life and consistency to our purpose. It will allow us to connect and provide various initiatives for different sectors. And having a synoptic and cartographic or a vision that we will map of our environmental objectives at a country level at an early stage is undoubtedly a great contribution to the deployment of sustainability and sectoral public policies. And this favors the ecological dimensions of all of these aspects of our project. So we'd like to welcome the progress of this initiative, and we await final results. And I'd like to thank all who have collaborated, and I will be here to support you in all phases of this project. And remember that we also serve your public policy objectives. and purposes. So I'd like to reiterate my appreciation to the UNDP team, and we are sure that we will garner very interesting and relevant results for our country. Thank you very much, and I hope that you have a very fruitful and excellent workshop. Thank you so much, Daniela, for your support during this round of consultations and your support throughout the project. We're also very thankful in general with the support provided by the Ministry of the Environment of Chile that has been working with us for the past few months. And that will help us access relevant data that's vital for this ELSA analysis in Chile. And as I said, it will be crucial for preparing our spatial maps that were mentioned by Daniela. So we will begin by giving you a broad overview of our joint sessions throughout these 2 weeks. We're going to explain the structure and the objectives of our consultation process. I'm going to ask Andres if he could share the agenda of the workshop with you. I think you've all received them, but it's important to have them at hand. So our second round of consultations will be held throughout 3 days. The first day is today. Well, we're going to provide an introduction and just retake all of the work that we've done or that we left behind in the past few months. So we're going to recap and again speak about the different achievements that we made throughout this time and just provide further context about the science that is behind the project itself. And as you may remember, it's the science of systematic conservation planning. And together we will discuss different aspects of protecting, management, and restoration. And we'll focus on goals that are focused on different areas for these pillars or for systematic conservation planning. Then Tuesday, April 12th, and Wednesday, April 13th, we will focus on co-creation of the ELSA map. And we'll do this through a series of participatory activities. And this will depend to a great extent on your expertise and knowledge. Now, the result will be a series of iterations or versions that will later be reviewed by the national team and validated by the Ministry of the Environment of Chile. So overall, this consultation is the heart of the project. And we do appreciate your active participation during this process for the next 3 days. It's important for you to be part of this voyage. Today, we will be addressing 3 main objectives. The first is to remind you of our accomplishments during our first round of consultations. Now, a couple of months have elapsed since we last met, so we're going to have to refresh our memories about the project vision for Chile, since there may be new people with us today. We'll speak also about our achievements. The second objective for our session today is to dive deeper into the science behind ELSA, which is systematic conservation planning, and just explain some key concepts that will be useful for our sessions next week. And for this, we will today hold or present some or make some presentations today and hold a Q&A session as well. Our third and last objective is to review and to listen to your feedback with regards to different elements having to do with ELSA. And this will be developed in a unique context where we seek to attain specific data for Chile. So we need your expertise, your feedback here to be able to know what are your national priorities and what we need to analyze a little bit further while we create or co-create the Chile ELSA map. On the screen, we see the agenda in a more detailed fashion. That's today's agenda. And Andres shared Andres shared with this in the chat with you. So we'll begin with the presentation that will address the UN Biodiversity Lab, and we will then speak about the private section here that we will have for Chile, and Annie Vernig from the UNDP will address this, how Chile can access their side of the UN Biodiversity Lab. And then we'll speak about basic concepts about systematic conservation planning, and this will be addressed by Jane Watson from the University of Queensland. And then Dr. Oscar Venter, our science team lead, will be the next speaker. He'll explain how systematic conservation planning can contribute to the ELSA project and how it's being used for this project in Chile specifically. Lastly, we'll hold a technical work session that's more informal, led by Oscar. So he'll be asking you for your feedback with regards to key aspects for analyzing ELSA in Chile. So for this, he's going to share some goals for protecting, managing, and restoring, and how the science team identifies certain areas in Chile for these actions that may be considered, and we will speak about that with you afterwards.
So before we continue and get into our event, why don't we turn on our cameras for a group photo to mark this opening day of our consultation? Andres, Veronica, Stefan can help us take the pictures, the photos. Okay, let's smile. Full house event, you know, there will be many pages of photos. So tell me when it's done, Vero, please. Okay. Esteban, Andres, we are ready? Great. Thank you so much for the photos. Now, let's continue. As you know, this project, Mapping Nature for People and the Planet, started in Chile in November 2021. And the first consultation was hosted virtually, but since then a lot has been achieved. And to summarize that progress to date and introduce the vision for the project moving forward in Chile, I would like to give the floor to my colleagues, Karin Molt and Daniel Alvarez from the Department of Biodiversity Policies and Planning from the Ministry of the Environment, who have also been supported by Andres Ceballos, our special expert for Chile, UNDP Chile. So at the end of their presentation, we will have time for questions, okay? Please feel free to drop your questions in the chat or raise your hand. Karin, Daniel, okay, over to you. Thank you, Cassandra. Thank you for being here today, the second workshop, ELSA Chile. So, we would like to talk about the process during all the period that we developed this work with UNDP Global, the Chilean ministry staff, and the representatives from public services and the academia that have helped us build this map that will soon be released. So, Daniel Alvarez will take the floor. He works with me at the Department of Planning to be able to make this summary, okay? Thank you, Karin. Good morning, everyone. Okay, I'll make this presentation, introductory presentation for the support of life in Chile, mapping of essential areas for the support of life in Chile. So as to brief newcomers to this process, and let me show you the projection of the results as well. Cassandra already mentioned this. There have been some other people involved, Andrés Ceballos, Esteban Delgado, Posca from the UNDP, the scientific team. There is a tight coordination with them for several weeks working on this, so it is worthwhile mentioning their names. Next, please. So, let us remember what ELSA is and what's the purpose of this project. This project, ELSA, it's an initiative fostered by the UNDP as a part of its global program on nature for development. And the purpose, the major purpose, consistent with what we want in Chile, is to accelerate structural transformations to achieve sustainable development. So it is a participatory methodology on the one part that is trying to map these essential areas for life support and create these maps of hope, as we call them, that shows to decision makers in a spatially explicit manner where they can find opportunities, and with that we seek to find benefits for humankind and the planet, increasing the resilience of territories and welfare of the population in bioclimatic crises and other types of crises. So, ELSA seeks to help decision makers to identify essential ecosystems in order to implement national policies and to achieve the goals of national policies. It maps policy goals that will contribute to implement sustainable development goals, Agenda 2030, and the goals of the three conventions: biodiversity, climate change, and land degradation. So it has plenty of perspectives, and it helps governments to determine how to use more effectively the actions to protect, restore, and manage these key ecosystems in a sustainable manner. ELSA has a methodology that the UNDP has implemented in many countries. We are number 11, I think, in Chile, and there is a whole annual scheme that's applied and that has been very useful. And the first step is to create a national vision, then co-create the map, integrate the results, and if you break down all these three pillars, in general you get, for the first pillar, to identify the policies and then priorities of those policies. We have identified national and global data to guide the analysis, to guide the identification of data identified to those policies. Then we also work on defining protection, management, and restoration of the national context based on those national policies. Now we have moved towards the co-creation stage, co-creation of the ELSA map. In between, we worked heavily with the scientific team and the national team to translate this information of multiple-layered information to make a selection and facilitate a scientific analysis of ELSA based on the algorithms managed by the scientific team and based on national data that will help us establish the ELSA analysis parameters. And this is the workshop of today. This is the first session of the workshop. The others will be on the 12th and the 13th. And with you, we will be able to identify some parameters in order to run this ELSA process and generate maps to locate where these protection, restoration,
avanzando a la tercera etapa, que es la integración de los resultados, probablemente la etapa desenlace de este trabajo de ELSA, que no es solo tener mapas por tener mapas, sino que esos mapas
Those
conecten
maps should connect or relate to policies and decision-making processes. So we will suggest recommendations for the policies as to how to apply the ELSA findings and how to internalize this decision-making process. I think this is very important, and this will continue beyond the closing of this initial process. So some progress already made based on the workshops already held. So we introduced in detail the characteristics of the ELSA project. We created a vision for ELSA Chile that will be increasingly clear. We will build capacities in conceptual and practical aspects in the systematic conservation planning phase, and also the selection of targets, public policy targets, relevant ones for ELSA Chile development, okay, in terms of protection and sustainable use. And the initial survey of spatial data susceptible of representing and accounting for the selected. So it's very important. Your feedback has been very important along these lines to fit these layers on which we are working. And there are some indicators that are relevant in terms of the process, right? Beyond the map, it is important that the process
y hemos constatado que hay procesos de comprensión que han ido aumentando en el desarrollo de estos talleres ELSA, como la conceptualización de lo que es la planificación sistemática para la conservación, hay una mayor comprensión, y también sobre las posibles sinergias entre los documentos políticos que se han evaluado y su relación con el cambio climático, con biodiversidad.
And their relationship with the map. So we started analyzing 25 public policy instruments and 8 field of interest. Next slide, please. You see that those 25 policy instruments, we extracted 12 targets, and we sorted them out according to their category, you know, nature and ecosystem, the category to which they belong. And we have identified topics such as preservation of ecosystems, preservation of protection of our species, and the most important climate structure, long-term weather strategy, national plan of landscape restoration. So these are the targets identified for which ELSA will work. And let me mention a few only in the case of protection. In the framework, or against the framework of national strategy, biodiversity strategy. So the process of restoration would include 1 million hectares of strategic landscape. So it was very important to identify these targets because we are going to work on these targets based on the maps. And also, suppose protection of species, the targets is to implement recovery plans and management programs to protect endangered species. Now, in terms of the sustainable agriculture strategy, the Action 3 axis, we think of fostering development techniques and more sustainable production systems, such as regenerative agriculture, organic agriculture, and water resources. We will at least work on 30 critical basins around the country. So those were only examples. I don't want to overwhelm you with so much detail, so many details, but you know, the important thing is that you have targets, priority targets related to the map. So we have 12 commitments that we select with you, 6 policy instruments, 88 space information layers, based on which we group the most important, and there are 24 individual layers that have been prioritized. You see the chart. You know, it's a very busy chart, I know, but just I want to show you that the number of lines is 12 commitments, 12 targets. And on the right, you have the spatial layers. So you see how many layers that have been considered for size. Of these 12 commitments, resulting from public policy instruments, and we allocate 88 spatial information layers. From all that, we go to 24 fine data files, okay? You have, for instance, bioclimatic stability gradient, underrepresented ecosystems, waterlands, degradation of land, desertification risk.
Y una serie de otros que van a alimentar entonces
Are going to feed the process to run the mapping with the relevant algorithms. Okay, these are 24 final data pillars. Okay. It's very important to mention that this was done in collaboration with a set of institutions that have not only been involved in workshops, but have also contributed with relevant information for the ELSA process. Here we have data from CINIA, Symbio, CONADI, INE, Data Social, and many other partners that contributed data information. The Observatory of Infrastructure and Water Resources, the Digital Map Library, global data, contributing global indicator data that are very robust and have been used in this process. There have been many contributors to this compiling of spatial information to be able to run the process. Next, please. And after creating these maps in the next few days, what's important is to look at the use projection of these ELSA results or outputs. We have identified a priori some relevant areas for comprehensive and diversified focusing of public policies, such as protection, restoring a sustainable use of biodiversity at a national scale. So we have wetlands, we have recoge plans, strategic areas for restoration, climate shelters, wetlands, as I said, restoration areas with small landowners. That's one line. The other line is forestry resources, priority areas for land degradation, reduction of forestry emissions, and that's another line. One more line is water sustainability and management by identifying critical basins, agribusiness sustainability, and urban sustainability, territorial water sustainability, urban parks. In the case of agribusiness sustainability, the National Policy of Rural Development and disaster management or disaster risk management, the environmental sustainability policy plays a role, as well as the national policy for the reduction of disaster risks. Now, the guidance of discussions of the transformation of the production matrix is also very important to adapt to socio-environmental changes. Facilitate debates on the location of actions that will commit the strategy on adaptation to climate crisis within the framework of a new planning and ordering system, and many other areas where this spatial information can be relevant. For instance, last Monday, we saw the launch of the Fondo Naturaleza Chile, which is connected to this project ELSA, because it is defining areas that have a potential to be restored or preserved. So there are connections that are not reflected on this slide, but there will exist. So that's all I had to say. I don't know if there are any questions. Thank you, Daniel, Karin, Daniel, and all those that supported the creation of this presentation. So we have some questions some time for questions from the participants. You can drop the question in English and Spanish. We have simultaneous interpretation. You can raise your hand virtually, or drop your question in the chat box. Perhaps we will get questions later. Okay, no problem. So Daniel, for the time being, seems that we don't have any questions. Everything is very clear. So, oh yes, there is one from Maria Jose Esquivel. Yes, Maria Jose, please. Good morning. Hello, Daniel. Daniel, we've been discussing some time ago about territorial ordering in the rural area, and considering that on March the 10th, rules were approved for territorial ordering to be applied to areas without urban planning. So, to what an extent the UNDP as a project can contribute to this discussion, because regional governments make regional plans for territorial ordering, but it's more a technical view. They establish location areas, and they establish areas under local protection. So what is the planning going forward to make this information available to them? Excellent question. The use of this information for territorial ordering purposes, it's a major input. Now, these results are applied nationally, but they have a spatial resolution of 1 kilometer long, the pixels, I mean. So we have to see what's the potential, but they can guide the sustainable protection actions that should be taken into account in terms of national planning. So if the ministry validates these outputs being legitimized along this process, they can be made available to be used for territorial planning purposes or any type of decision-making processes. So that is something to be addressed more in detail, but the potential is there, you know. So once the mapping is ready, when the map is ready or the mapping is ready, we shall see. But I think it's going to be useful, not at the expense of regional, you know, calculation or analysis, that of course it's necessary that they do. We are working on regional planning and mapping, and there's input available there. So we have to work on a national, regional level in a more consistent manner. I mean, we have to discuss the scope rather, you know, have to talk about the scope. Thank you, Daniel. Thank you very much. So let us continue with the session. We are running a little bit behind. So now I would like Maria Jose, do you have other questions? No, I'm going to lower my hand, okay? So now let's move on to the presentation by Annie Berging, Strategic Advisor on Spatial Planning for UNDP. And she's our science coordinator for the ELSA project. She will provide a brief recap of the UN Biodiversity Lab platform and show you the workspace we are in the process of creating for Chile. This UN Biodiversity Lab workspace will serve as a central data repository for the data gathered through the project, and also it will serve as a collaborative space that you have the option to leverage to support your national needs related to spatial data. So, Annie, over to you.
Hello, everyone. Good morning. I'm going to make my presentation in English. I will just briefly change my channel.
Okay, perfect. So as Cassandra mentioned, we're now moving into the second part of today's session, which will explore the science elements behind the ELSA analysis. So in this presentation, I'll introduce two web-based tools that we'll make available to you through the project: the UN Biodiversity Lab and our ELSA web tool. So for those of you who attended our first stakeholder consultation, I gave an introduction to UN Biodiversity Lab there. But today I'll start out with a brief overview of the platform as a recap, as well as to introduce it to any participants who are new. Next slide. Okay, so simple question. What is UNBL? We created UNBL nearly 4 years ago to support parties specifically specifically in their commitments to the Convention on Biological Diversity. UNBL is a free open source platform that provides access to high quality global spatial data layers and analytic tools. Best of all, it doesn't require any GIS expertise to be able to access or use. Next slide. So over the past 3.5 years or so, we've built a community of practice around UN Biodiversity Lab that includes over 400 policy relevant users from 60 countries. And we've had over 75,000 views of the public side of the site. Looking forward, we're interested to build on this foundation to use UN Biodiversity Lab to support the Mapping Nature for People and Planet project in Chile. Next slide. So today, instead of going into more details about UNBL, I'd like to focus particularly on its features that can support the ELSA project. Next slide. So on this slide, you can see 5 key features that we offer through UN Biodiversity Lab, as well as through our ELSA web tool. Our goal is that in the future, we'll merge these 2 platforms into a single interface, but for now, they're separate. So for the remainder of this presentation, I'd like to talk through what functionalities we offer through each and make sure that this is clear for all of you moving forward. I'd like to focus in particular on what are numbers 2, 3, and 4 on this slide, as they're particularly important for the Mapping Nature for People and Planet project in Chile. Next slide. So you can see all 3 of those on this slide, and for the remainder of my presentation, I'll go through each. So first, we'll talk about using UN Biodiversity Lab to access project data. Second, we'll talk about using the ELSA web tool to execute and iterate the analysis. And third, we'll show how you can access dynamic metrics for Chile through UN Biodiversity Lab. Next slide. All right, so first, through UN Biodiversity Lab, we're happy to provide Chile with a secure workspace where you can easily access all of the data layers that Danielle talked about that we've collected through this project for use in the ELSA Chile analysis. This workspace will eventually have the final ELSA maps available as well. You'll also be able to upload other national spatial data layers into this workspace in the future. We'll make it available, fully available to all of you who are participating today, and give full ownership to the Chilean national team after the close of this workshop. Now, I want to emphasize here that this is not intended to replace any existing national monitoring systems or platforms that are available. We're just offering this as a resource that can support Chile in whatever way you see fit. Next slide. So here you can see an example of the workspace that we created for Haiti, another one of our ELSA pilot countries. On the left panel, you can see some of the national data layers that we used as part of the project. A few of these are loaded into the right-hand panel and the map view that you can see. So we'll be creating something very, very similar for Chile that we'll share in the coming weeks. Next slide. All right, second, the ability to actually run the ELSA analysis. This is available through our ELSA web tool, which enables you to modify parameters for the ELSA analysis, to actually run the analysis, and to download the results. So our lead scientist, Oscar, will talk you through the ELSA web tool in much more detail in his presentations later today, as well as our work together next week. So I'll leave it at this for now. Next slide. here you can see a quick screenshot of the web tool for Haiti. As I mentioned, you'll have a very similar one that we'll be sharing with you next week for Chile. Next slide. So finally, I'd like to highlight our final characteristic offered through UN Biodiversity Lab that I also introduced during our first stakeholder consultation. Through UNBL, we offer the ability to calculate dynamic metrics for your country or for any area of interest within your country. You can see all 8 of these metrics on this slide. And basically, all of these are ways that you can monitor the effectiveness of biodiversity interventions, such as those recommended by ELSA in Chile. So I won't go through all of these today, but like I did in my presentation way back in our first consultation, I'll just highlight the protected areas metric. Next slide. And one further, perfect. All right, so you can see this on this slide. We offer a graphical interface with summary reporting, which you can see in the left panel, as well as a map of protected areas in Chile, pulling from the World Database on Protected Areas. And an interface and a map like this is available for all 8 of those metrics that I introduced on the last slide. Next slide. All right, so with this presentation, I've tried to just provide an overview of both the UN Biodiversity Lab and the ELSA web tool, as well as showing how they offer different functionalities that can come together to support you during and after the ELSA project. First, to collect all national data within a central repository in UN Biodiversity Lab. Second, to run the analysis on the ELSA web tool. And third, to use UN Biodiversity Lab to monitor the effectiveness of biodiversity interventions using our dynamic metrics. We're very happy to take any questions about the differences between these 2 platforms or how you can use them going forward. And we look forward to continuing the conversation over the next several sessions together. So with that, I'll say thank you very much and hand it back over to Cassandra.
Muchas gracias, Annie, por la presentación y por habernos
Thank you, Annie, for illuminating
UN Biodiversity Lab y ese futuro espacio privado que va a tener Chile. Tenemos entonces ahora oportunidad de preguntas, ya saben, pueden escribirlas en el chat, levantar la mano virtualmente. Aprovechemos que nos acompaña Annie el día de hoy. En todo caso, también Annie va a copiar su correo electrónico para que le puedan enviar alguna pregunta. Parece que no tenemos ninguna pregunta. Agradeceré por favor la interpretación. Parece que está habiendo algún problema con el canal. Yo estoy en el canal.
Sorry, that's me. I was muted.
Listo, gracias.
Okay. Sorry about that, Annie. So basically, that we thank you for your help for explaining the UNBL, giving us this overview, and we will facilitate your email. And pardon me, I was on mute. We're going to focus now on systematic conservation planning. It's the science behind the ELSA project. Now, you all received a brief introduction during this first consultation round. But now that we're in the second round, I think we need to refresh our memories. So we're going to hear a short recording from our Australian colleague, Dr. James Watson. He's a professor of conservation science at the University of Queensland. And you may remember this video from our first consultation because he has been a part of our initial consultation rounds. So let's hear his video.
G'day. My name's James Watson, I'm a Professor of Conservation Science at the University of Queensland. And today I'm going to be talking about conservation planning and how it relates to essential life support areas that has been brilliantly led by the United Nations Development Programme team and other great organisations around the world. So what are conservation decisions? Well, I think we've got to put it in the context of the real world. We make decisions every day. We make decisions, when we go outside. Do we take our umbrella? We make decisions on a Friday night. Do we go to this party or that party? These are decisions that are real life, and we always are going through those decisions, so we shouldn't be scared of them. And in conservation, over the last 50 to 100 years, we've often walked away from going through these difficult decisions about really translating them into a process that actually makes sense. And we should do it more transparently and more honestly. And they simply equate to these questions: why, what, where, when, how, and who. If you start breaking it down into that, you can start actually working through a very simplistic but very transparent process to get to an outcome that works for biodiversity, for ecosystem services, and for the people involved at the landscapes and seascapes where conservation happens. Basically, conservation planning and conservation decision making is about how should we decide on conservation priorities. I think we all know horror stories in the past that we've actually focused on special animals or places that are really suitable for some parts of biodiversity or some parts of value to humanity that has discounted other places. We really spent a lot of time focusing on some things, but that has meant that other things have missed out. In my country of Australia, we've spent a lot of time protecting some very charismatic species such as the koala, but many, many other endangered species have simply missed out on any kind of conservation attention as a consequence. And I'm sure in the nation that you sit in right now, these problems arise as well. Now, what conservation planning does is actually put all biodiversity on the table and all ecosystem services on the table in a transparent way. So you can work through all levels of biodiversity, ecosystem processes, the costs and threatening processes that happen, their condition, and work out what is the priority for that nation or for the people in the landscape, or even globally, to think through what comes first and what comes second when you think about conservation. Now, fundamentally, until recently, what has limited conservation planning is good data. We've really struggled to get good data on where biodiversity and other ecosystem services have been located and what threatens these elements of biodiversity and ecosystem services. It's been a really big gap, and it's been highlighted by many studies around the world. And if you haven't got good data, you can't have good plans, regardless of the principles adopted. But the beautiful thing recently there's been this fantastic data revolution over the last 5 years. The big data revolution that everyone's getting so excited about is actually real, and it's actually changing the way we think about conservation. So to make good conservation decisions, we need good spatial data, and that good spatial data is becoming increasingly available. So the excuse that we don't have the data at our fingertips is actually not really valid much anymore. So with good principles and good data, we can actually identify the locations and the intensities of actions that we need to do to overcome the threats to save biodiversity and ecosystems. Now, at a fundamental level, there are really only 4 principles you need to follow to get a good conservation plan going. You need to make sure it's connected, adequate, representative, and efficient. That's called the CARE principles, C-A-R-E. So if you get these 4 principles right, you will get a good plan every time. And it means basically, if you get these 4 principles right, the whole is always more than the sum of its parts. Connected is very simple. It means that from a species or an ecosystem or a process perspective, things can actually be connected and populations can support each other. So if it's not connected, these processes are broken, the system will fall apart. From an adequate point of view, you must make sure you've got enough of anything that you value to ensure that it can persist in the future. If you don't have enough of it, it won't persist. Representative means that you make sure you get everything you want in the system. It's like a recipe book. You can have a perfect cake, but if you don't get all the right ingredients in that cake, it's always going to taste bad. So you've got to have a representative system. You've got to make sure that all the pieces of the cake are actually there, the ingredients, so you can cook it at the right temperature and get the cake to the quality that you want. So you need a representative system and all those ingredients that you want in that conservation system to be there. So you want species, habitat, and ecosystem processes. And efficient, well, you need to make sure you get it at a minimal cost. My personal opinion is we often over worry about budgets. I think conservation, we really try and we should always ask for more. We always actually try and scrape by for too little. But the bottom line is, like with all walks in life, the less it costs, the better, the more chance of success. So an efficient system is always a better system. So they're the CAR principles that we should always follow when we're thinking about planning. And as you do your workshops and as you do your planning in everyday life, if you follow the CARE principles in conservation, you're always going to succeed, I think. So that's the basic lecture that I wanted to give, and I wanted to say thank you for your listening, and it's been really rewarding thinking through this. My email address is james.watson@uq.edu.au. Happy to take questions at any time, and I look forward to hearing how you go. Thank you.
Agradecemos a James. Él no pudo estar con nosotros el día de hoy. La diferencia
We do
horaria.
thank Dr. Watson. He finds it difficult to connect with us because Australia's on the other side of the world. But if you have questions, he's always very happy to respond to questions, and we will get those questions to him and get the response back to you. Since we know the basic principles of a systematic conservation planning now, we have a better idea of them. I'm going to welcome our science team lead, Dr. Oscar Venter, and as he was with us at the first consultation round, so you already know him. So he's going to tie in what systematic conservation planning is and how it works, or not what it is, but how that ties into the ELSA project and how it's key to the science for creating our ELSA map in Chile. Thanks for being with us, Oscar. I know it's very early on the west coast of Canada. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you. Thank you, Cassandra. It's my pleasure to be here. I just wanted to start by thanking everyone for their attendance and participation today. We have 3 days together to move from where we are right now in the project to actually co-creating and producing the essential life support area map next week. So we have a lot of work to do, and your role as participants in this work is critical. Now, today, you're hearing quite a lot of different presentations, and I have one to go through as well. Today, the first day is really primarily to get everybody up to speed as to the essential life support area process and where we are in that process for Chile. There will be some participation from you in my presentation, so that'll be the start of the participation and your feedback into the process. But it's really next week, after we've laid the foundation today, next week is we're going to be reaching out to you in a very big way in our sessions to get your participation, to get your feedback, to actually mold and create the map. So the first day next week, we're actually going to go through every one of our spatial data sets, and we're going to ask your opinion as stakeholders and experts about the data and how we should use it. We'll take that feedback, the science team will take that feedback, change the essential life support area tool, and then come back for our final day next week. We'll produce in real time. We'll use the systematic conservation planning tool to produce the essential life support area map. And then we'll actually analyze it together in the session. We'll look at how well it's performing. And then we'll ask your feedback for how we might need to change things before creating the final essential life support area map. So I just wanted to highlight, we're very grateful for your attendance and participation, and your participation is actually going to help mold and create the essential life support area map for Chile. It's a very important input, which we haven't had until now. Until now, we've been working with science, tools, as well as the Chile core team, closely with Esteban, Andreas, and Danielle. So we're really glad to now open that up to the broader group of experts and stakeholders that are on the call with us today. Okay, so building off what was just presented by James Watson, he provided really the foundation of systematic conservation planning. Now that SCP was designed primarily for biodiversity conservation and protected area planning. It's really become the gold standard for planning for biodiversity conservation and expanding protected areas or situating new protected areas. It offers a foundation for integrating many different values as well as many different data sets into a complex problem and finding good solutions to those problems. So it presents a very nice foundation and set of tools for identifying essential life support areas. But the essential life support area process is actually quite a bit more involved and complex than planning only for biodiversity conservation. So I just, in front of you here, I have, this is our mission statement in the project. So I just wanted to circle back to this. Our mission is to identify the essential life support areas in Chile, which, if protected, managed, or restored, will support national nature-based commitments to biodiversity, climate change, and human well-being. Now that mission statement really captures how we build from biodiversity conservation to the broader objectives of ELSA. So the first thing to note is that we're not only talking about protected areas, we're talking about protected areas, but also we're talking about sustainable management. This could be sustainable forestry or sustainable agriculture, other forms. And we're also talking about restoration. We're talking about active or passively helping ecosystems return to a more natural, more resilient state. So here we're talking about 3 different actions. And we're not only talking about biodiversity, we're also talking about climate change. And this can be 2 things. It could be helping ecosystems play a role in mitigating climate change, as well as helping us adapt to climate change, buffering us from some of the worst effects of climate change. And we're also talking about human well-being. This can be food security, jobs and livelihoods, and other forms of ecosystem services. So I just wanted to highlight that our scientific basis is systematic conservation planning, but we're broadening this out to consider more nature-based actions and more benefits of those actions. Next slide, please. So when we're thinking about spatial data and the tools, this diagram shows some of how this ELSA looks at the landscape. It doesn't only look at protected areas. This might be the green pixels you see on this landscape here, but it considers other nature-based actions within these pixels. Now we call these pixels planning units. These are units that we can consider for taking nature-based actions. These actions include the protected areas, like I mentioned in green, but it could also include sustainable management. These would be the yellow planning units, and restoration. These would be the blue planning units. So when we're producing these maps and when we're looking at the data, we're considering these 3 nature-based actions. And in fact, for Chile, we have a 4th one, which I'll present a little bit later on. Next slide, please. So as we use the systematic conservation planning, we're constructing the decision problem in a way that's called the maximum coverage approach or maximum coverage problem. So I just want to briefly describe the main components of that approach of systematic conservation planning. So the first component of the maximum coverage approach is to meet area-based targets for nature-based actions. So the area-based targets means basically how much of Chile are we looking to protect? How much are we looking to sustainably manage? And how much are we looking to restore? So those are our area-based targets for each action. Next slide, please. The second component that we consider is that these actions should only be evaluated in areas where they are potentially feasible. So we're not looking to convert all of Santiago into a protected area. That's simply not feasible. We need to have what we call hard constraints on the landscape. So parts of Chile which could be considered for protection, could be considered for sustainable management and for restoration. And it's these nature-based actions and the hard constraints that are the focus of the rest of the session today. So I'm gonna look at them in much more detail through my presentation. Next slide, please. And the final component, which is really the focus of our second day of consultation, which will be next week, is to select or identify areas in Chile that will maximize the benefits for biodiversity, climate, and humans, right? So we have nature-based actions for Chile. We have where these actions are possible, climate and humans, all comes from, or the starting place for it is all the national policy review. It comes from reviewing existing policy documents that Chile has identified what actions it wants to take, how much of those actions, and the benefits of those actions. So that's a really critical ingredient of the Essential Life Support Area process. It's supported by the global science team, but the real decisions and the components that go into it all come from the policy review. Next slide, please. Sorry, before we look to the policy review, I just wanted to reiterate that what we're trying to achieve with the Essential Life Support Areas, when we consider those three key steps, is basically to identify the places in Chile that will deliver the greatest benefits when achieving national commitments to nature. That's our objective. Next slide, please. Okay, so as I was saying, the decisions for how to construct the ALSA problems, which data to use and what targets to set, the starting place for that was the initial consultation starting in November last year and the policy review that underpinned that. There were three key questions that we're trying to answer through that policy review and the hackathon last year. The first question was, well, what are the nature-based actions to protect, manage, and restore in Chile? What do these actions entail? And in fact, as we asked that question, we found that a fourth action revealed itself, focused on urban areas, which we'll look at a little bit later on. We also needed to determine, once those actions were defined, well, where were these actions possible? So that was the hard constraints. And what benefits do these actions confer for biodiversity, climate, and human well-being? So that was the first question that we were focused on in the policy reviews. What are the nature-based actions? Next slide, please. The second question that we were trying to have answered was, well, what are the area-based targets for each action? And specifically, what percentage of Chile's land and inland water areas should be covered by each one of these actions or have been composed to review? Next slide, please. And then the final question we were asking through that work was, well, what are the priority nature-based solutions that we're trying to achieve, that Chile is trying to achieve through those actions? So what are the outcomes from the nature-based actions that Chile is is seeking. Is it biodiversity conservation? What type of biodiversity conservation? Is it supportive human well-being? Specifically, what type of human well-being? Is it food security, disaster risk reduction, and so on? So that to answer the third question is going to be our focus next week. But 21 specific planning features for Chile. So there's 21 specific data sets which are used to guide the essential life support area process. Okay, so that's my attempt to briefly summarize the overall framework for how we're using systematic conservation planning for the essential life support area process, and how we are coupling that with the policy review and policy hackathon. So now I'm going to go into the specifics of the nature-based actions of protect, manage, and restore, and the fourth action focus on urban areas, basically the results of that policy work. I'm going to actually have specific questions that I have for the group here that I'm going to be asking as I go through this these final slides. It's feedback that we need to help finalize the project before we really jump into it next week. So before I get into those specifics, I thought I'd maybe just step back a minute. I know you've listened to a lot of presentations. I don't think we've even given you a break. Sorry about that. We're kind of slave drivers here at the UNDP. But maybe I would just step back for a minute and ask if there's any questions or comments from what you've seen so far, from what was presented before I started, but then also this general framework that I presented. Yeah, if there's any comments or questions, now would be a good time for them.
Gracias, Oscar. Entonces, si tienen alguna pregunta, comentario.
Are there any questions, or can drop them in the chat or raise your hand? And as you very well said, we can take 5 minutes, 5 minutes. A 5-minute break. Okay, Claudio, yes, please. Some questions and then we go to a break, okay? Thank you, Cassandra. This question related to everything we discussed, this block in particular about the functioning of the tool. Okay, we have worked on the selection of certain layers of information that will allow the system to generate these maps. Now, my question is, what's the capacity that we have as a country and then contribute with territorial layer or other layers of information with more local prioritization rationale, so that we can continue contributing, information and building on these maps. I don't know if you have understood my question.
Te escuchamos, Oscar.
Yes, thank you, Claudio. I believe I do understand your question. It's that we have a current project now to map the essential life support areas at the national level to support the national policy commitments, but that I think you're seeing opportunities to continue to update with new data sets, because often every year there might be some new data sets on particular areas, and having the latest data being used is always the best. I think you're also discussing about the potential to downscale some of the work to address more territorial level questions. We have a number of countries where we've continued beyond the initial national level ELSA work to, in some cases, downscale the work. For instance, we work with Colombia in the central region to downscale the national ELSA and to focus specifically on water security in a place that was critical, housing much of Colombia's population. And we basically altered the work and brought in new data sets to specifically address their territorial problem around water security there. Also, in the case of Costa Rica, we continued at the national level to build on the initial essential life support area process to then focus on national climate adaptation planning, bringing in much more information about climate change. So for this initial project that we're working on right now, we have a specific objective like we've been talking about, and it's to, by next week, identify the national essential life support areas that support these 12 policy commitments. In the scope of that particular project, we won't be able to, for instance, downscale and continue to update and change. But I believe that the door would be open to further collaboration, as we've done with some of these other countries. If there's a desire from Chile to update, create new iterations, if there's a desire and a view that there's value to continuing to develop the ELSA process, and particularly change it to different scales or different questions, we would be available to help support that through additional work. Thank you, Claudia.
Muchas gracias, Oscar. Y sí,
Thank you,
Esteban.
Oscar. Yes, Esteban, please. Thank you, Cassandra. To supplement Oscar's response to Claudio, and I think it's very much related to the question asked by Maria Jose some time ago. One of the parts of the results or outputs of the project as the national map of the essential areas for life support is the installation of capacities in the country. And the installation of the tool is part of those capacities. The tool, you know, for the geospatial information or reporting of the country. We have talked about the platform of the Environment Ministry, where you will have the tool, the ELSA tool, launched to run these simulations or do these exercises for preparation practices. You know, it would be stored at a ministry server with the capacities or features to reproduce this systematic exercise at any scale. So we will have to look into the objectives, information available, but the technological capacity will be installed. So Claudio, Maria Jose, all that will be available, and it is welcome. Okay, to conduct the exercises that will allow us to focus on certain specific instruments in any domain, and that require explicit representation, you know. Thank you, Cassandra. Thank you, Esteban, for supplementing this response by Oscar. So with that, on that note, we go to a 5-minute break. It's 11:40 in Chile. Up until 11:45, we'll have this on our screen. There will be a timer, you know, on a screen. So in 5 minutes, don't go away.
Bienvenidos a todas, todos de regreso. Están todos conmigo. A ver si
Welcome. A ver, are we all here? Thumbs up. Happy faces. Something to know that you are here connected. Claudio is celebrating. Perfect. So let us move on. This final session, it's a technical session focused on the discussion, some key elements for the ELSA analysis. This last session has the specific objective of receiving your feedback on these goals and elements for the ELSA analysis in Chile. And this will be very, very useful for the next sessions regarding the co-creation of ELSA maps. So Oscar will explain again about what we did in the first part of the project, where we identified these aspirational goals and targets and those based on areas. And he will take some time with you to discuss the definitions, protection, management, and restoration as a group. This session will be a more informal, interactive session with Oscar. So I hope we can count on your contributions and your feedback. So please, Oscar.
Okay, thank you, Cassandra, and thank you everybody for coming back after that short break. I'm just bringing my presentation back up, and we can go forward one slide, please. Okay, so for my final, I believe 9 slides, I'm going to be focusing, or 12 actually, focusing on the nature-based actions for Chile, the area-based targets for those actions, and the hard constraints. So that was some of the components of the ALSA that we talked about earlier in my presentation. And next week, we'll focus on much more of the spatial data, but here we're focusing really on these nature-based actions, what they are for Chile. I should note that the definitions for each one of these actions, there was quite a bit of information supplied through the initial policy hackathon, as well as follow-up with the national core team in Chile to ensure as best we could that these definitions are in line with Chilean law. We didn't have from those documents, we didn't have a clear definition for each of these actions. So we've developed these proposed definitions, but if there's any feedback on them for how to change them to better fit the Chilean context or align with the existing law, now would be a great time to give us that information. Okay, so the first nature-based action is protect. It's to protect nature. So the definition that we have for this, what is protection in Chile? It is protected areas, but also other effective area-based conservation measures. We don't have a clear definition of what those other measures are, but we're recognizing that protection occurs not only from protected areas, but also through other actions. These areas can allow for some human use. Examples could be tourism, harvesting of trees, or other non-timber forest products. So it's important here that we're not considering strict no access protection only. We're considering the full range of protection and other effective conservation measures. Protection serves to maintain ecological conditions, improves environmental outcomes, and prevents and controls its deterioration. And that all comes from references made in Chilean law about protected areas. So I just wanted to ask, this was the one that the definition that got most guided by the Chilean law. I just wanted to clarify if there's any feedback on this definition or if it does seem to be a good fit for Chile. Okay, no one's upset with the definition, so that's a great start. On my next slide, if we can go forward, I do have a specific question now for the group, and I would really like some active feedback on that if possible. So we know what protection means now, what it's defined for Chile. The question now is, okay, well, how much protection is Chile trying to achieve? So this we got from the first of the 12 priority policy targets. This target was that by 2030, there's an expansion of at least 1 million hectares of the current area of official protection of territorial and aquatic ecosystems. So if we take this, that equals about 1.36% of Chile's land and inland water areas. And it would bring Chile's protection from about 26% of the country currently up to 27.4% of the country. So the questions I have is, first, that the number, I just wanted to confirm, in the translation, sorry, in the translation of the slide, there was a slight edit made. You could see the 1 million hectares. That first decimal point was actually a comma, and then it was a decimal point. So I just wanted to confirm that this target was 1 million hectares and not 1,000 hectares. This is something we can follow up with the core team afterwards as well. But if anybody can comment on this policy target now, that would be great.
$1 million, Oscar.
Okay, thank you, Esteban. Okay, so that's good. And now I have another question. I'm aware that Chile is part of the High Ambition Coalition, which is a group of countries seeking for ambitious protection targets, in particular a global target of 30% by 2030 under the current global biodiversity framework, the emerging global biodiversity framework. So I just wanted to really ask the group for any discussion whether we should use this specific 1 million hectare target, and that's a specific target right now for official protection. It doesn't necessarily cover other effective area-based conservation measures. Now, understanding that Chile is part of the High Ambition Coalition, I wanted to ask whether we should consider a slightly higher target when we're identifying the essential life support areas of 30% to encapsulate both official protection, but also other effective area-based conservation measures, and to support the High Ambition Coalition. So that's my question, whether we should up this target slightly to get to 30%. Johanna, I see you have your hand up.
La mano levantada de Johanna. Sí,
Johanna, please, yes.
Sí, gracias. Estoy un poco confundida.
I'm a little bit confused, you know.
Sí, lo que entiendo yo del
What I understand
es que es adicional
is that
1 millón de hectáreas a la superficie actual.
is to add 1 million hectares to the current surface.
Entonces entendería que es.
You are cutting off, Johanna. Cassandra says you are cutting off.
I don't understand what.
You are cutting off, Johanna.
Yeah. Voy a apagar mi cámara, tal vez ahí se escucha.
Okay, I'll turn off my camera, Johanna says.
Lo que entiendo es que
What I understand
ese millón de
is
hectáreas
that
adicionales
that additional million hectares
sería a un porcentaje mayor a 1,36 del porcentaje actual.
would be more than 1.36% of the current land surface. Oscar, did you get the question? Cassandra is asking.
Yes, I did. So we'll have to then recheck our mathematics. So 1 million hectares would be 10,000 square kilometers. I believe we were using a figure of 756,000 square kilometers for the area of Chile. So we did 10,000 divided by that's 756,000. Just confirm.
Yeah, but Joanna says that this additionally, no, and it's only, I think, terrestre. I mean, it's in English, the land, no the aquatic.
So that would not include the inland water areas, for instance, wetlands or rivers or lakes.
I don't know.
Yeah,
That's
don't.
what they mean. Yes. Yes.
Maybe somebody there can be more specific. Maybe Daniel or say Esteban.
Yeah, in the chat we have a
Sí,
comment.
quizá me parece
Juan
adecuado.
Orellana.
Sí, tenemos el comentario de Juan Luis Orellana, también del
We
Ministerio
have
del
the
Ambiente.
comment from Juan Luis Orellana in the chat. It says, these are land data. Marine protection is 42% of the exclusive economic zone, 146.7 million hectares. Perhaps, Daniel, you would like to clarify that?
Parece que el mío, Natalia, te damos la palabra.
Natalia, we give you the floor. Yes, thank you. Thank you for this session, and I apologize if this was already discussed in the previous session, okay? ELSA or the proposal, do they only consider land and marine surface? And if it considers marine or water areas, does it consider only the exclusive economic zone, or this percentage only includes the land surface? And if you consider marine or ocean or water surfaces, how do you show that on the map? What's the difference between the two ecosystems? Is it based on the same criteria, or do you make a difference between land, terrestrial, and oceanic? Okay. And in the chat it says the project for now considers land surface and continental waters. So, Esteban, perhaps you can help us clarify. Juan Luis, yes, no, Juan Luis was before. So please, Juan Luis, and then Esteban. Thank you, Cassandra. I'm very attentive. And my hand is the same color of the algae behind me, you know? And I have that picture on purpose. So, Daniela is not here. So, Daniel is not here. But I work in the Department of Protected Areas. I'm in charge of protected marine areas. And I do the counting and acreage, and I don't know about the land surface, but I think 27.38% is terrestrial land, including lakes, wetlands, rivers, but up to coastal area, up to the coastal border. From the coastal border up to 200 nautical miles is the economic exclusive zone. And protected coastline of Rapa Nui, the Juan Fernandez archipelago, that is very, very big surfaces. With that, we reach 147 million hectares. Although we talk of square kilometers when it is marine, surface, which is universal. And that is 1,470,000 square kilometers that are protected. 42 or 42.3%.
I have other questions, but I can ask them later. I don't want to waste any time. Thank you, Cassandra.
Esteban.
Esteban?
Cassandra.
Thank you, Cassandra. Okay, let's just clarify. The goal that you're viewing on the screen is a goal. Is it a target for a long-term climate strategy that was recently approved in the country, probably in the last trimester, the last quarter of last year? So it's very recent, the second half of the quarter. So is this million hectares in addition to what we have already laid out for conservation, including continental or inland water and territorial conservation? So it's in addition to that, to what the state has already. So he's not asking a question, he's just saying that these million hectares is in addition to what has been calculated in Chile. So we're speaking about 1 million hectares in addition to what Chile has set for conservation. So this was a very recent long-term strategy as part of Chile's signing of the agreement mentioned by Oscar. So it's an additional goal that makes the country ambition. It's for the High Ambition Coalition that was mentioned, and it includes more mitigation, further mitigation and adaptation to climate change. Okay, thank you, Esteban. In the chat, you can find the goal. I've placed it there so we can all have the same understanding of this. I've shared a document. Now I see that Joanna's hand is raised, and then we can continue to the presentation, Oscar. But one more question. Okay, no, it was a mistake. She left her hand up by mistake. So you can continue, Oscar.
Okay, thank you, Cassandra. And thanks everybody for clarifying the scope of this target. It is the terrestrial and inland aquatic ecosystems. I just wanted to circle back to whether it sounds like we should probably stick with this 1 million hectares and not increase it to the 30% of Chile by 2030.
Can you repeat that question? Can you repeat that question, Oscar?
Yes.
Right now.
So the question was whether we should directly use this 1 million hectares of official protection only, which would bring the country up to 27.4% of inland terrestrial areas, or if we should increase that to 30% of terrestrial areas in support of the High Ambition Coalition. So we're asking about the area-based target, whether it should be a final number of 27.4%, and that's taking the 1 million hectares and putting it on top of what is already protected in Chile, or if we should increase that to 30% by 2030. My sense is we should be using the 1 million hectares, but I just wanted to bring this question to the group. Yes, Claudio.
Tenemos la mano levantada de Claudio. Hay una
Okay, Claudio. Yes, Claudio. I think that I would mention as a caveat that we're speaking here about two different ecosystems, because if the objective of the long-term strategy speaks about inland waters and territories, I guess, would we be including oceans? But I think that it's better to just mention the million hectares with that objective, the one that you mentioned, Oscar, just clarifying that it's only inland waters and territories, does not include oceans. Any other reactions? Daniel, you have your hand raised. Thank you, thank you. Okay, to respond to Claudio's comment, I think that in order to make a final decision, we have to speak with Diego Flores, who's in charge of the protected areas. He's in another department because we need we could say, the official data. And also we have to understand the long-term strategies because we have to be able to map this. So we need to be sure on the data and understand what Claudio's mentioning, but also consulting with Diego to see what he thinks about this, and then just quickly make a final decision. I don't think it's going to be a big issue. I think it's not about taking a point of view. It's just understanding what we decided or what Chile decided on. Who had the final say? Okay, thank you. Karin? Yes, I wanted to add to what Daniel just mentioned. Although Chile is promoting the higher ambition goals of the high ambition coalition, etc. This decision, the official protection number or figure, is a political issue, or it's, remember that we're starting a new presidential term, and they have to make specific decisions with regards to protection of areas and conservation of areas in Chile, and how they're going to move forward with that, and take into account other areas that may want to be protected. So before finding out the panel's decision, before asking Diego and the other individuals, and before thinking about the ambitions ourselves, I think that we still have to go to the new government authorities and ask them in general what their direction is going to be for this new presidential term. Okay. All right, Karen. Oscar, you can continue.
Okay, thank you for that. That sounds reasonable, Karen. I think we'll probably use the figure from the current document, recognizing that the future commitment might change in a new presidential term. The good thing is that the tool that we're creating for the essential life support areas, it's quite easy. The user interface will allow changing this area-based target. So future iterations to reflect any new targets can be inputted to the tool to change the essential life support area map. That's a dynamic tool that can be updated like that. Okay, thank you. If we could go to the next slide. So the next question for protection is, well, where is protection potentially feasible? Now, this isn't a full feasibility study about which communities might be willing to participate and allocate more protection. This is a very preliminary map-based assessment of feasibility for protection. Now, for this, we use what's called a human footprint. It is similar to a layer that's been used by Chile before to map land degradation and desertification. It basically measures, in the map that you can see there, the extent that humans have modified landscapes by building roads, cities, agricultural lands, electrical infrastructure, and other forms of habitat modification. So to determine potential places, just a very preliminary potential places for protection in Chile, we used this human footprint. We looked at existing protected areas in Chile, and we asked what is the normal level of human footprint in existing protected areas. So we looked at basically the 95% of protection in Chile. We looked at the human footprint score, and we said this describes what sorts of lands are protected in Chile. And then we could use that description to look through the rest of Chile that's unprotected and determine places that are in a similar condition and therefore potentially able for protection. We can go to the next slide. So what we found was that if we look at existing protected areas in Chile, the vast majority of these areas had a human footprint score of less than 10. And the scale for the human footprint goes from 0, no signs of humans there at all the way to 50, which would be the human footprint score in a large city. So we found that most protected areas were in quite good condition with a human footprint score of less than 10. So then we mapped all areas in Chile with a similar score, and you can see them in this map in yellow. So as next week, we searched to identify new places for protection that yield the greatest benefits. It's these places in yellow on the map that will be considered for protection. The places in blue have been deemed to have too high of a human footprint to establish a protected area. These could be places that are cities or have many houses, extensive road networks, etc. So using this human footprint, this is how we identified most of our hard constraints for Chile. This is the first one, focus on protection. Just give a second if there's any comments or questions about this method, the hard constraints. This question of where is protection possible in Chile?
Sí, aquí tenemos una pregunta de
We have a
Juan
question
Luis
from
Orellana.
Juan Luis Orellana. He says, how do you define human footprint? Can you repeat that again, how you defined human footprint for the project? Would you mind repeating the definition?
Yes, so the human footprint, comes from a global map called the human footprint, which maps 8 indicators of how humans have modified natural areas. It includes data on human population, urban extents, navigable waterways that boats travel on, railways. I'm sure I'm missing some, 1 or 2 more, but there's 8 layers like that are mapped into the human footprint. And then they're all added together to come up with this overall index of how modified landscapes are. So some landscapes will have many of these pressures overlapping. They're highly anthropogenic. Others will have none, and they're really wilderness areas. And other places have some level of this human footprint.
Muchas gracias, Oscar. Sí, le quedó claro
Okay,
a...
he understands fully now.
No sé si hubiera alguna otra pregunta, si no creo que podemos
Any other questions? If not, we can continue. Oscar, continue.
Okay, thank you. We can proceed to the next slide. We're now on to our second nature-based action. This is restoration. So the definition here is assisting in the recovery of ecosystems that have been degraded or destroyed. Restoration can involve actively planting vegetation or simply removing pressures so that nature can recover on its own. This is called passive restoration. And neither of these always entail fully returning an ecosystem to its original state. So this is our definition of restoration. You can see it's not only focused on forest areas. For some countries, restoration is focused only on forest cover, but for Chile to be in line with existing policies and law, this covers all ecosystems that could be considered for restoration. Priscilla, do you have some comments on this definition?
No, only I just wonder that the reference, I mean, maybe could add in the presentation at the end after you send that, because usually the definition of restoration is not really sometimes for some colleagues there are different definitions in other sectors. You know what I mean? So if helps us if in the bottom of the slide you have the reference.
Okay, thank you for that suggestion. We will have to add two. We were shared a definition for landscape restoration as well as a definition of ecological restoration. And this definition is something of a combination of those two that we wanted to make sure it encapsulated both landscape restoration and ecological restoration. But thank you for that feedback to include the references for those initial definitions.
Yes, it's only to have the same language when we talk with other sectors, you know, like agriculture sector or in the housing departments and other sectors that maybe they don't understand or they are using different definitions. Thank you.
Claro que sí, Priscila, muchísimas gracias.
Understood, Priscilla, thank you. I'm going to give the floor to Daniel from the Ministry of the Environment. Perhaps he could also complement and shed more light on the definition and then allow other participants to participate. Daniel, Natalia, did you have your hand raised as well? Well, do you mind just adding your point of view to what Priscilla is saying? That way we can just proceed in that order. Yes, there are different definitions for restore, of course. But in Chile, our national restoration, landscape restoration plan in Chile, approved by the Sustainability Council that also approves different definitions tied to that plan. We understand restoration within public policy as let me refer to that. It's recovery of large extents of land with different types of diverse uses, with like heritage sites where there are different interests. And they're addressed as heterogeneous landscapes that may be different, that may have a different focus to restoration. So it's not necessarily focused on restoration per se, ecological restoration, because it may be more of a, because we may include more cultural practices or recovery of ecosystem services or reforestation or water harvesting. Because if we add all of these, it just leads to overall sustainability of our landscape. So it's overall recovery. So it's a very broad definition, the one that we use in Chile. The definition definition, that's we could say the political definition. The definition that you have in your slide, I think that it's not really contradicting any of our definitions in Chile. I think it just has more of a global perspective than what we use in Chile, but it's not completely incompatible with what we use. They are compatible because defining landscapes, our definition of landscapes has to do with recovery of ecosystems that have been degraded or destroyed, and that have to do with the human footprint, eliminating human pressures or native endemic vegetation, but this doesn't necessarily, like you said, mean that we're going to return the ecosystem to its natural state. If it's possible, yes, we would go ahead and do that. But we're looking for this middle situation, this intermediary position that we could be happy with. So okay, I think that we're not dealing only with forestry here, but I'm going to interrupt him for a second. I have to ask him a question.
De bosque, sino también puede haber humedales, sí. No, dije, no es incompatible. Bueno, que es una fórmula un poco extraña. Sí, sí, es una fórmula rara, sí.
Okay, sorry. He's saying yes. He can work with this. He can work with this. He's saying it is compatible, but we just could tweak it to be able to adapt it to Chile's situation, to Chile's definition, which has a broader perspective with regards to its definition, the Ministry of the Environment, because it includes wetlands, and so we can just add certain nuances, and we could work with the definition. Okay, thank you, Daniel. So now we clearly understand the doubt that Priscilla had with regards to definition. So we see that Trevor had his hand raised before, sorry, Natalia had her hand raised before you, Trevor. So first, Natalia. Natalia? Thank you. Okay, I understand that this platform is also going to be useful for monitoring purposes, right? Yes? Because if it is, I want to ask how oversight or monitoring would work for restoration, because given the broad diversity having to do with diversity of ecosystems, of restoration, of the different types of actions that can be taken tied to restoration, how do we know that a landscape or a territory has already been restored? How do we make that difference? How would you answer that? Thank you, Natalia. Oscar.
I'll just clarify what we're focusing on now, the essential life support area mapping. This is identifying the priorities for protection, management, and restoration. The monitoring side isn't really part of the ALSA process, but it is part of the UN Biodiversity Lab, which Annie talked about earlier in the session today. And we'll circle back to at the end of this consultation to discuss more of the monitoring. But what the ALSA process that we're focusing on right now is not really a monitoring process. It's a prioritization or land planning process. Thank you for the question.
Es que lo digo porque lo que se monitorea.
Okay, I'm asking because what we monitor afterwards and how we measure final results are truly tied to how tangible or how definite or how concrete that definition is. So that's why I think we have to consider, are we going to include monitoring as part of restoration? That's why I'm asking.
Okay, thank you for that. And I think we're going to circle back with Danielle as well about tweaking this definition, which is, as he said, it has more of a global perspective, tweaking it to potentially better reflect the Chilean context. So maybe that the monitoring could be part of that, but we'll circle back to Danielle with that for refining this definition here.
Thank you.
En esa misma línea, Oscar, entonces Trevor quería complementar la intervención.
So Trevor wants to add to what Daniel mentioned. Trevor? Thank you. Thank you for your feedback. My colleague Natalia said something that was truly important. We do support the National Restoration Plan for landscapes, but we'd like to add monitoring to that. And because it serves as a baseline for potential interventions. But the definition that Daniel mentioned And what I understood, and what I think is missing, however, is the human well-being component. So ecological restoration, landscape restoration is a important component, of course, to ensure the long-term stability or continuum of these protection initiatives. So, but we have to think about the long term. We don't want to face problems in the long term. So I think that given what we heard just now, that the idea is to maximize or the benefits for diversity, for human beings and climate. So I think we should include human beings to this definition. Restoration should also include human well-being. And human well-being isn't necessarily like, oh, let's buy more television sets. Oh, no, it's not about that. It has to do with restoration of ecosystem services and and landscapes where people reside, and having the right ecosystem services to ensure good well-being, proper climate adaptation, food security, all of these variables. But human well-being, I think, should be included within our definition in Chile. Thank you, Trevor, for your comment. And Esteban has also shared the definition that you're mentioning in the National Landscape Restoration Plan for 2021-2030, so you can take note of that. Daniel, did you have a comment, an additional comment? Well, I wanted to also refer to monitoring. And I think that these areas that we're going to map are potential areas, remember. So it doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to take action. It just means that we're going to focus public policy efforts and commitments to that. Because remember, there's so much to monitor, but we have to change the scale once we enter the territory and change. But it just gives us a synoptic view, the country, where to aim our efforts, where to prioritize our efforts, which we don't have right now at a national level. It's important to have that, to at least begin to have that. And then we will begin to monitor these efforts, but that's another scale with different indicators. We can't get ahead of ourselves. So I think we should first start, look at our national restoration plan for our land, and then see how public policy comes into play here. But here we're dealing with potential conservation, remember, that's what's important. Okay, Daniel, thank you for making that clear. It is truly very accurate. And I wanted to mention something that's in the chat. I think, Claudio, this has been already answered, but this is a definition of the project that, as Oscar mentioned, needs to be adapted to Chile's context a little bit further than what we did. So we've heard that we have to include the concept of including functionalities and ecosystem structures, and among other comments. We also heard Karen's question, Oscar, about the database, the global database. What year is it from, and how often is this global data updated?
There are a number of data sets that are coming in with different years and update schedules. For the human footprint data in particular, which we've discussed previously, the year is 2013, and it's in the process now of being updated to the year 2020.
Muchas gracias, Oscar. Y tenemos la mano levantada de Nicolás.
Thank you, Oscar. Nicolás would like to take the floor now. I just joined the project. I work for the Environment Ministry, the Department of Environmental Economics. I've been working on ecosystemic service. I believe we had to be very accurate to define what are the ecosystemic services, because not all of them should be included in terms of restoration, because there will be trade-offs, you know. It's very well known that a landscape that is intervened can maximize the systemic services provided to society. But I don't know if that is the goal of the conservation plan for the whole territory, or there could be a mix between conservation and the services without a trade-off. So we had to be very clear to define that, to assess how they can benefit society without not being at the expense of the protection of ecosystems. Thank you, Nicolas. Oscar, please.
Thank you for that, Nicolas. Your point is very well taken about the need to be specific about which ecosystem services and recognizing trade-offs. It's getting ahead of where we are. That what you're discussing is actually going to be the focus of next week. We're going to look at all of the values that come from protection, restoration, management, determine which ones of them are the most critical for Chile, which are the most important, and you as participants are going to be telling us that. And then the following day, we're going to run optimizations, and we're actually going to look at the trade-offs, see if any of them are unacceptable and should be mitigated, and then go back and relook at some of the data. So thank you for that point, and that's really going to be our focus of our group work next week. Okay, so in the interest of time, I believe I'll move forward from the definition of restoration to the next slide, which asks us about the area-based target. The good news is we have very specific targets for restoration. The fifth, I believe the policy commitments document has already been shared with you by Cassandra. We might drop it again for your reference. There are specific targets here for restoration. Target number 5 speaks to incorporating 1 million hectares of strategic landscapes into the restoration process. And target 7 speaks to 500,000 hectares of land being incorporated into the restoration process. So we bring these targets together, which gives us a percentage of Chile's land terrestrial areas of almost 2%. So this serves as our area-based target for restoration. Believe this is quite a straightforward one. I might save our time for discussion for the sustainable management, where we have more questions. For now, we could go to our next slide, speaking to the hard constraints. So here again, our need is to define where in Chile restoration is feasible, but again, just a preliminary mapping exercise. Here we use the human footprint again, and our general approach for the essential life support process in other countries has been to identify the middle 60% of a country for human footprint. So the idea is to exclude the most intact part of the country, because those places don't really require restoration. They are still in good condition. And it's to include the most modified 20% of the country. And the idea there is that it's so severely modified, for instance, it could be cities or intensive agriculture, that restoration is not really feasible. So we focus on the middle 60% of the human footprint, where, for instance, there might be some people living in these landscapes, there might be some agriculture, there might be some roadways through ecosystems. but there's still an opportunity to restore some of these systems to try and improve the resilience of the ecosystems. So the middle 60% for Chile is a human footprint score of more than 1. So it has some human footprint, but less than 11. And that results in the yellow parts of the map you could see here. So these are the parts of Chile that we're considering, that the tool will consider for restoration. There's still a whole bunch more data that we're going to look at next week that looks at the benefits of restoration and other actions to try and identify the best places within these yellow areas. But these yellow areas are kind of our starting point for restoration. I'll maybe ask briefly if there's any comments or questions about this method for setting the hard constraints for restoration. Okay, not hearing anything. This is an amazing group for participation. It's probably some of the most in-depth and
Tenemos, Oscar, las manos levantadas de Daniel y Reinaldo.
Daniel and Reinaldo have raised their hands. Daniel or Reinaldo, yes.
Perfecto, entonces Reinaldo.
Let's see, Reinaldo, please. I am surprised by the chart, the map on the right. I see a great part of the north of Chile that is yellow. I understand that that is plenty, it has plenty of restoration need, or it's in restoration need. And the purple part is the part that doesn't need so much restoration. You know, the yellow part where you have the Atacama Desert, there hasn't been human intervention because it's the most arid desert in the world. So if that part is yellow, does it require restoration? But there hasn't been intervention by human beings there. So it's not very intuitive what I see. I would expect to see more restoration when more restoration need in the south, you know, where you have more human beings intervening. Of course, the part of the north, I'm not sure if my interpretation is correct. The north where you had the desert would not require so much intervention because we don't have human beings, big populations living there, you know.
Just the human footprint. So, Reinaldo, we've actually excluded the most modified 20% of Chile for consideration for restoration. So some of those places with very high human populations, extensive land conversion, we consider those to be too modified for restoration. So some of those southern and central regions of Chile are being excluded for that reason, that they're being deemed as too modified. We're also excluding some of the most intact places. So you can see in southern Chile, some of those places are highly intact along the mountains and the coast because there's really no human footprint. Are we able to go back to slide number 12? Okay, right here, thank you. So this is showing the human footprint from Chile. And it's showing, you can see there are some signs of human activity in the Atacama Desert. Now, I'm sure these are constrained only to some areas, but this map, the human footprint map, has been validated to be quite accurate, but it's not perfect everywhere. But this map is telling us that there is some level of modification in northern Chile, and that's why those areas are showing up as yellow. as potentially places that could use restoration. Okay, thank you. We could go back to the slide that we were on, slide number 16. Danielle, did you have a question, or shall we move forward?
Sorry, but what means yellow
Gracias.
and
No
the
sé,
other colors? Can
Oscar, gracias. Lo siguiente, que claro, veo el mapa.
Okay, I see the map and I say this is one of the layers or parameters or hard constraints, but it's not the only one to look into the restoration opportunities. There will be, of course, other elements at stake that can result into other potentials. And we know, based on our background and history, that the coastal area in Chile is an area that has been degraded and that merits restoration. So, when I see it in purple, purple means that it is outside of the restoration efforts. I don't know if I am understanding the colors correctly. Because I think there is an opportunity of restoration in some of those areas, you know. It's like in our memory, imprinted in our memory. So could you please clarify that?
Yes, thank you. So that's right. The purple areas would be outside of what can be considered for restoration in ELSA. And the yellow areas are areas that are inside of the scope that can be considered for restoration for ELSA. We've done this mapping using the human footprint by excluding the most intact places and the least intact, the most modified places, and focusing on the middle 60% of Chile. We do have the opportunity, if it can happen in the next couple of days, to further refine this map before we identify the essential life support areas next week. Or alternatively, we could note some of the deficiencies in this component and look to further improvements in later iterations.
Sí, Oscar, gracias. Me parece necesario hacer eso porque, mira, te señalo que, por ejemplo, hasta algunos
I think
programas.
it's necessary to do that because the government programs have also said, okay, restore the coastal areas. So it's strange that something that has been recognized doesn't appear there. So have to look more in detail into this layer. Esteban wanted to take the floor too. No. It was the same as Daniel said. As part of the 60%, that is the target restoration area, perhaps we need to be more clear on what Daniel said, that 60% is not homogeneous, no. So it probably requires to generate a couple of intermediary categories. Oscar is taking note. And Natalia says, will you use other space variables other than the human footprint in order to prioritize restoration?
Yes, we'll use a lot more. And that will be the focus of our next session next week. This is just a starting point for areas to consider. I understand that there's government indication of the importance of restoring coastal areas. From the policy hackathon, we have our list of 12 priority policies, and that focus on coastal areas wasn't part of that priority list, which helped guide the ELSA process. So I think we just need to recognize that this one aspect might have slipped through as part of that prioritizing the policies. And it's something that we can look to add in to later iterations. Yeah, hotspots for biodiversity, hotspots for ecosystem services, for carbon, for water supply, for food security, all these things will come in next week. We'll really be looking at the bulk of the data next week. Thank you, Priscilla, for the comments in the chat there. Okay, I might move forward. We're running very short on time, so I'm going to try and go quickly. The next slide is focused on sustainable management. So just briefly, our definition here is quite broad to be in line with the documents we've received. Sustainable management techniques used in agriculture, forest, and other ecosystems. So we're talking about broad sustainable management of ecosystems that are utilized for livelihoods and food security. So these are ecosystems that are actually being used in some way, being actively managed. And there's a balance here between ecological needs and human needs. Sustainable management techniques can include sustainable forest management and agricultural practices that increase soil organic materials, reduce erosion, and increase habitat structure while simultaneously supporting human needs. So there were some comments about human well-being as part of the definition for restoration, which we're going to revisit. I just want to point out that that is part of the definition for sustainable management. I want to move to the next slide, which is somewhere I have a specific question for the participants. Now, our area-based target for sustainable management. This isn't something we found in any of the policy targets or the policy hackathon. So we need to set an area-based target for sustainable management. That's the basis for how the tool runs. It then finds the optimal places to get benefits from that sustainable management. So right now we're using a default value of 3%, which is something that we've landed on through the previous pilot essential life support areas. So we can use that for Chile unless there's some suggestion now for another policy target for sustainable management. And just to remind, for our area target for protection was 1.3% of the country, for restoration about 2% of the country, and here for sustainable management, we are just using a default and it's 3%. But if there's any feedback for a specific policy target for this area.
Gracias, Oscar. Tenemos la mano levantada de Claudio. Te escuchamos.
Claudio, you have the floor.
A esta consulta de Oscar quizás
Now, Oscar, there are targets or goals that are not prioritized. Some tools that we are considering in the analysis, for instance, the forestry policy, productive measures, or goals, or reforestry goals that could be included in the analysis. And we should make a comment.
Tener en consideración que al momento de definir protección, también se explicita que se pueden obtener recursos. Se habla de recolección de productos forestales en madereros y otros.
Should obtain resources.
Algún cruce de superficie entre lo que es superficie de protección y de gestión, y en ese sentido.
Muteate, por favor, porque sí. So, We have to manage this in a sustainable manner, and all those actions that are considered as part of this would be considered better as part of the management, I think. Thank you, Claudio. We have comment by Trevor. Yes, Trevor, please. I feel that perhaps there are certain policy documents that were not considered for this part here. And these are documents that should be considered, perhaps what has to do with forests, there is something that has to do with the sustainable management of native forests, and that is around 200,000 hectares. So perhaps we should include something related to the agricultural sector and other sectors. So although 3% is a lofty goal, this is something that we could substantiate, you know. Thank you, Trevor. Oscar, please.
Okay, well, thank you. That's a strong point about this other within the sectors of forestry and agriculture. There are specific policies that might not have made it through the policy hackathon that could be useful for guiding this target. I would ask if anybody wants to send us some feedback through an email. Cassandra, if you could drop a contact email into the chat. And if you want to send us any specific policies for forestry and agriculture that we could review very rapidly and potentially help us guide this target, that would be great. We'd appreciate that.
Claro que sí, ahí nuestro colega Esteban.
Our colleague Esteban from UNTP Chile will support us with that. So Esteban, if you write your email address in the chat box.
In the interim, we could go to the next slide. Sorry, everyone, you can see I'm trying my best to speed up a little bit. Here's the hard constraint for sustainable management. This is easy. This is similar. This is identical to the hard constraint that we use for restoration. That sustainability is most important in these intermediate landscapes where there are humans interacting with ecosystems, but there are values in those landscapes for both ecosystems and for people. So again, we've excluded the highly converted 20% of Chile, and we've excluded the highly intact parts of Chile and focusing on this middle 60%. Again, this is only the starting point for identifying the priority areas for sustainable management. But just wanted to show this is the same map that we use for restoration, again, based on the human footprint. Danielle, do you have a comment or question?
Gracias, Oscar. Sí, bueno, la verdad es que el tema de sustentabilidad.
Yes, now sustainability is like a cross-cutting condition. That does not exclude any portion of the territory.
El concepto que nosotros tenemos. Ahora, aquí entiendo que se ha hecho una discretización entre el área de restauración y otras de gestión sustentable.
Now, regarding sustainable management, perhaps the terminology is not very clear. Sustainability is a condition for sine qua non for the whole territory. So perhaps we should be more accurate about the definition. as to what type of area for sustainability purposes we are thinking of. We want to reflect certain objectives, but more specific ones than a general condition of sustainability. So perhaps there, Esteban would like to add something. What is it that we say? What is it that we are saying when we say sustainable management? If we make a distinction between protection and restoration, all the rest of the country should be managed in a sustainable manner. It would be strange, you know, so to speak, to identify some areas in the map of the country where you shouldn't manage in a sustainable manner. You know, it's that should be resolved in more conceptual manner in terms of the ideas that we are managing to make this distinction, or to reduce the concept that we are management as a sustainable management, in order to identify more clearly where we should focus. Now, Oscar, back to you.
Thank you. That's a great point. And I think we need to clarify that the essential life support areas for sustainable management are the most critical places where the greatest benefits could be derived from focusing some particular actions in these places, but that does not at all preclude the greater national level commitment to sustainable management. Our translators are going to sign off in 2 minutes, which will handicap my ability to communicate. So I believe Cassandra is going to wrap us up pretty quick. I want to thank everyone for all their input.
Muchísimas gracias, Oscar. Efectivamente, ya estamos llegando al final de nuestra sesión. Como bien menciona, la intención es que nosotros, disculpa, estoy escuchando en inglés.
Thank you. We're reaching the end of our session. That's why we divided our sessions into 2 weeks to get your feedback and for Oscar to be able to work on your feedback and fine-tune this presentation or fine-tune everything you've mentioned and come back to you next week. So I hope that you take home a better understanding of systematic conservation planning, which is the basis of the mapping project for ELSA, Mapping Nature for People and Planet. We do thank you for your input, for your feedback throughout this session. It's all welcome, and it will definitely help us for next week when we will conduct the first iterations of the Chile ELSA map, which is part of this project. So I also wanted to copy the link for the Learning for Nature website for the first workshop, because I have heard throughout the session that there are many new people on board that didn't attend that session in November. So if you would like to review November's workshop, you can go ahead and view the recording. And of course, you can always access the information through our website. Esteban, would you mind also providing a final reflection? Thank you. Thank you, Cassandra. We don't want to delay any further, but we'd like to thank you for your participation at this workshop, for all of the comments that you have made. I think they're going to be very helpful and will help us improve the work that we we will do next week. And that undoubtedly will help us attain better results. So thank you for your active participation, and I hope to see you all next week for our next 2 sessions. Have a great afternoon, and thank you, global team, and thank you to the interpreters for their hard work. You're very well. Thank you, Esteban. So Esteban has copied his email, has dropped it into the chat box, so you can send any additional documents to Esteban that you think is important for us to analyze for management. You said that there were other policies that were pertinent. So we will reconvene next week during our session. As you can see on the slide, it's the 12th of April, the same place, same channel. That's Chile time. So in the meantime, have a wonderful week, and we will see you soon. Thank you. Goodbye.
Gracias, Juan Luis. Gracias.